important, I think, for people to understand that the DSM-5 is just one way of looking at things.
I am fine with dissociating. The natural psychedelics, I thought that I had died. No, I'm a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Welcome to Manic in Miami. This is Holly, and today we have a special episode. I'm here with Dr. Scott Fisher, who is leading clinical trials in psychedelic research at Siegel Trials in South Florida in Broward County. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here, first of all.
Thank you for having me, Holly.
Thanks.
My name is Scott Fisher. I am a psychiatrist, and I am the lead facilitator, trainer, and clinical program manager at the Center for Psychedelic Research at Siegel Trials. And our trial site is located in Lauderhill, Broward County, Florida. So I started my psychiatric career officially in 2014. I worked in a group private practice in Broward and Palm Beach counties for 6 years, and then operated my own solo private practice for 2 years before coming on full-time here at Siegel in the current role that I just mentioned. So in addition to extensive, private practice, and clinical work and just sort of general psychiatry, I've done specific trainings in psychedelic therapy and research. And I have a lot of interests in that field in psychiatry and psychedelics for mental health in general.
Yeah.
But my real specialty is in the psychological support, psychotherapy, the set and setting that is usually used as a part of the psychedelic studies and treatments that is really prevalent today.
Right. I would like to disclose that I have done psychedelics. I have done ketamine therapy for bipolar depression. I know that I would be excluded from the 5-MeO-DMT study, but I found that to be just absolutely a mind-blowing, powerful experience.
I'm sort of curious, and I wonder if your listeners might be curious if you did want to share any more details about that experience.
Let's see. I had a pretty large dose of it. My friend actually dosed me. She uses an environment that is modeled on traditional medicine and indigenous communities, but she does not go by the term shaman. She's a Caucasian woman. And so she set this whole scene for me, which was important, using, feathers and music and drums, blankets, pillows, different, sage, incense, I can't remember, and fans and things like that, and then gave it to me in this very ceremonial way. And then shortly after inhaling it, it was a vapor, it's powder form, and I inhaled it and held it in a couple of times, and I just fell back onto the pillow and was absolutely out. And she was watching me the whole time. She was hovering over me. It only lasted about 20 minutes. To me, it felt like a couple of days. I had no sense of time. Yeah.
Are you able to describe or put into words what it was like
Absolutely.
when you were in that state for the 20 minutes?
Yes, I absolutely had what's called an ego death, which is a complete, dissolution of self and of ego, of the personhood that we know. And my experience was, first of all, it was very dark. It's not what you think of as colorful, rainbows and patterns. It was very dark. There were some dull kind of burnt orange, brownish sort of psychedelic patterns. And I interpreted them as spirits who were coming down, and you could see them. They started small, as if they were flying down from the darkness, from a dark sky, to speak to me. And I could understand what they were saying, but it's not that they were speaking in words. It's just that they were somehow communicating through their movement or something. And the communication I got was, there is this kind of light, this one energy, and we would like to take you there. And do you want to go? I will disclose that my friend called me a natural at psychedelics because I am fine with dissociating. There's no problem surrendering. For me, it's like, okay, take me away. Like, no problem. I know some people really fight it. And so I didn't at all. I said, okay. And this happened probably within an instant. But in my memory, I told them, yes, I'll go. And I went, and it was almost as if a vacuum kind of zapped me up. And at the top, I saw this very bright, glowing white light. And from there, I can't explain it, but I ceased to exist in my own self, in personhood. And there was this feeling of joining an energy that we're all part of. And it's impossible to describe that, really. It's so difficult to describe. And when I guess I came out of that, first of all, I thought that I had died. I thought I experienced death, and it was very similar to the way people have described near-death experiences. And when I started coming out of it, you would think I would be terrified, but I wasn't. I was so at peace, and I so slowly came out of it. And I was kind of crying tears of happiness. And then I could, sit up and move again. And there was this wonderful music on. Actually, I made the playlist, and I have it on Spotify. And it was just, it changed everything, really, because even though I had had a few psychedelic experiences in the past, it really did instill this deep compassion and this peacefulness about the inevitable death that we will have one day. And I, had no fear of death. I used to think about death all the time and get kind of scared. Like, I can't believe this is happening. I say I don't have much anxiety, but I have major anxiety about death. And after that experience, I didn't. And I still have that experience in me. So it was a long-term impact.
When was this you did it?
I did this in October of 2021.
So almost 2 years ago.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I still have that in me. I think about it sometimes, and it's a very good memory, but I understand why some people might fight it a little at first, because it's scary, and you're being asked to basically die and surrender yourself. And it does turn out to be this profoundly spiritual experience that is very positive. And I know that psilocybin can be used at end of life to kind of take away the fear of death for people, or people with terminal illness. And it did the same thing. It completely took away the fear of death and reminded me that all of the horrible things that happen in the world and what we're doing to, our environment and plant life, animal life, and of course to other humans, and what we have done historically. For me, I had the sense that all of that goes away and we join this like pure energy where none of that exists anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that is such a beautiful description. Just want to say thank you and give appreciation for describing that, because it sounds so powerful.
Yeah.
And, also really want to honor, it sounds like, in terms of the integration, you really found some new perspectives.
Yeah.
That it seems like you
I believe
really highly value
Yeah.
some of these shifts in perspective. And I guess I'd be curious if there's any other aspects of, those shifts in perspective are already so valuable that perhaps there aren't any other aspects of the integration that have come up for you. But if there are any, I think also that would be really interesting to hear.
Yeah, I actually also had another 5-MeO-DMT experience with a smaller dose. And I can say with both of those, I had this experience of forgiving people who I really believed, had wronged me, and I had the right to be, have this very negative attitude toward them. And I was kind of thinking about it from sort of a one-sided, of course, like a little bit of a selfish perspective, maybe victimizing myself and not being fully able to assess the situation from the other person's perspective. And I feel that it opened, again, it just changed the way my brain was wired to think about a particular situation. And I had this great empathy and actually ended up asking for forgiveness from these people, because I felt that maybe my response and reaction to a certain situation was unwarranted and unfair. So that was an interesting thing too.
Mm. Yeah, I'm really, really glad you share that. That also sounds like a very powerful gift, you gave to them, but also that
Yeah.
you gave to yourself. I think,
Let it go.
yeah, in our psychedelic sessions, we many of us learn that, the way that we're approaching certain problems, sometimes with really entrenched beliefs or certain resistances, um, they're methods of trying to really protect ourselves and promote our well-being. But it turns out that paradoxically, those coping mechanisms aren't working very well for us or those around us. And sometimes we have to do what can feel not intuitive. So, for instance, forgiving when you feel very wronged can feel dangerous and unsafe, unfair. But many people find that when they do that, it actually is very liberating and healing, even if just for themselves, and often for the people who they're in relationship with. And similar sorts of things with, sometimes with depression or anxiety, people will often resist and just want to suppress those emotions and make them go away. We find that paradoxically, when people let that pain in and acknowledge it, become aware of it, and try and greet it with some level of like compassion and understanding, that there's less suffering. So this is kind of a bit of a Buddhist concept that pain is inevitable in life, but suffering can be minimized by becoming less attached to not having that pain or having to have certain things in our lives to compensate for that pain or to feel happy. So we often will use that concept in our preparation, dosing, and integration sessions is to allow pain in and to release attachment to certain aspects of that, so that your suffering is reduced.
And I could also mention one other very powerful psychedelic experience I had while I was in a very, very deep depression. And I had suicidal ideation all the time. I had anhedonia. I isolated myself, which makes things a lot worse, rumination, all of those things. And I just felt worthless and hopeless as a person in this depressive episode. And I used psilocybin to try to maybe to do something. And I used a very small amount, almost like a mini, just a little more than a microdose. And for some reason, I had this out of body experience on a small dose. I have no idea why. But I went to this place where I guess it was kind of a heavenly place. And it was very colorful. I was tiling myself. I had learned how to lay tile. And so I was really into tile. And I had looked at all of these pictures of the pink mosque in Iran. And I went to this place where there were cascading pink tiles that were building the pink mosque around me. And there were like Hindu deities there for some reason who I was speaking to. They said they would brought my pets in, and they were like, there's, your cat and your pet, your domestics. And they said it was such a joyful place. They said, do you want to stay here? As in, you can just die and stay here. And I told them it's very tempting, but now that I'm here, I hope that I can come back someday. But I think I want to go back to Earth. I think I want to go back to, the material world that I lived in. And I had gone into it being on the brink of, having suicidal thoughts. And I went back, and my cat was tapping on my head. Maybe that's why she appeared in there. And I don't know. And I was happy to be there. And it completely, it was incredible. It just completely changed everything. It just reinvigorated an appreciation for life.
Well, that's so powerful, and just thank you again for sharing about your experiences, because I think it really makes this sort of discussion and conversation so much richer when we get to move from sort of the abstract, and the data and the science, and move into really the personal narratives. That's where I think the storytelling can really, to me, it's even more powerful sometimes than scientific data.
And I think that it also kind of made me ponder the idea of consciousness and the mind over constantly looking at the neuroscience. And
Yeah, I agree. Psychedelic experiences can often invite us to welcome in paradox,
yeah,
to, looking at, maybe different ways of looking at things that can sometimes feel mutually exclusive, and actually invite, well, maybe it's both and
Yeah.
rather than either or. And so
Yeah.
from sort of the subject object, duality, which has been, such a, huge thing in philosophy, and it's often, there's undercurrents of that discussion that get brushed under the rug, I would say, not to mix my metaphors, in psychiatry, where oftentimes there's real heavy emphasis on wanting to look at objective data, but at the end of the day, I always make the point that people come to treatment not because they found out there's a problem in their brain that needs to be fixed, but they're experiencing a problem in their mind. Trying to find correlates in terms of objective data, the neuroscience, the neurotransmitters and chemicals, etc., I think is valuable. But at the end of the day, what we're really trying to treat is the person and their experience of their life.
Thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely true. 2 notes on that. There is a psychoanalyst, Nancy McWilliams, who I don't know if you know who she is, but yeah. She said that people don't come into therapy because of exactly what you said, these symptoms that are listed in the DSM. They come in for personal problems and things that are affecting their lives. This diagnosis at some point is fundamentally not meaningless, but doesn't matter as much as your individual experience, which is hugely varies from person to person as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting you bring Nancy up, and I did not expect our
really?
conversation would turn to her. She wouldn't remember me, but she gave her grand rounds when I was in training in Northwestern in my psychiatric training.
I love her.
And I was extremely impressed by, the subtlety and nuance and knowledge base.
Yeah.
She's, in my opinion, kind of a living legend in contemporary psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
And in terms of diagnosis, she wrote a book, I believe it's called Psychoanalytic Diagnosis.
Yes.
And, it's just important, I think, for people to understand that the DSM-5 is what has used these labels: generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, etc. And understand that the DSM-5 is just one way of looking at things, and maybe for many people, really not the most important way of understanding how they function.
Somehow it's ingrained to focus so much on the diagnosis itself. What are you bipolar, or do you have bipolar disorder? No, I'm a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Like, what difference does it make? Like, really?
Yeah. We're very far from understanding, how these are sort of medical diseases or illnesses per se or not.
Right.
But in terms of like really having a coherent picture of, say, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, and sometimes, in psychiatry and mental health, I think there is just sort of a general sense in the public, and even sometimes a general sort of assumption by psychiatrists and therapists, etc., that we know a lot more than we actually do about the science and the objective side of these problems.
Yeah.
And that can be dangerous sometimes. We don't know yet, exactly who would benefit from psychedelics and maybe who should not take psychedelics, and how to, maximize, effectiveness and efficacy for as many people as possible with these, and also minimize safety risks, not to necessarily give people any specific advice about their problem, but just to try and spread as much awareness about, the potential benefits of psychedelics, but also the potential risks that we're still trying to learn a lot more about.
I think of, the musician Nick Cave. His son, I think now several years ago, took LSD and jumped off a cliff and died. And so I think people hear 1 or 2 horror stories like that and kind of just write it all off. Sounds like I've done psychedelics a lot, but I actually haven't. But when I was very young, I tried LSD and I went straight into psychosis. There was a time that I did a small amount MDMA. Everyone was fine except me. I went straight into psychosis.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that you've had both good and bad experiences with psychedelics, and regardless of who we are and, what diagnoses we may or may not have been given. Most people who've taken psychedelics have had both good and bad experiences. Could someone with bipolar disorder do okay with maybe a really short-acting, psychedelic, like a 5-MeO DMT that's in and out, in 20 minutes? Is there less risk of, say, provoking mania with that versus, say, LSD, which can last 12 hours or more? We don't know the answer to that question. Also, the different psychedelics sometimes have overlap in terms of what they're doing with the neurochemistry, what kind of receptors, neurotransmitters, et cetera, are being affected. But there's also key differences. And so are there certain types that, might be better for certain sorts of problems and others that should be avoided? And, a lot of the psychedelic research that has happened, in the last 20 years or so has been sponsored by nonprofits who have gotten charitable donations to support their research. The U.S. government, up until recently, was not supportive with any sort of grants, I think because of the promise of the research supported by nonprofits like MAPS, like the Hefter Research Institute, like the USONA Institute. As a result of, their research, now we are starting to see some changes from government and actually seeing some awards coming from, those major institutions. The research, also a lot of the current psychedelics that we want to research are on Schedule 1 by the DEA, and basically means it's very highly restricted, even for research purposes. So if we are able to get some rescheduling, either as a result of kind of changes in our regulatory bodies viewing, whether these should have been put on Schedule 1 in the first place, MDMA clearly has a medical use because, it's followed, the FDA structured sort of process for, proving that. Then those might be able to be moved off of Schedule 1 and into a less restricted controlled substance category where research might be more easily done at a lot of institutions.
I have a question related to trauma. For example, if you have trauma from your childhood that you've repressed very much, and maybe there are pieces that you can't remember at all, is it possible for those memories to come up, kind of like a deep psychoanalysis with things like trauma responses and mind-body responses to these traumatic events that have happened, like child CSA, child sexual abuse or something like that?
Yeah, there's definitely, anecdotally a lot of reports of people during, psychedelic sessions having repressed memories, come to the surface.
Okay.
So from that standpoint, there is a lot of work and research being done on what sort of trauma-informed, psychotherapy methods might be employed, during psychedelic therapy and in integration sessions afterwards to help support people who, even if it's not a repressed memory, but if the trauma just figures greatly into, their journey and their experience of their psychedelic dosing. So there's sort of a balance between not leaving them hanging with this trauma memory and just like, okay, now I remember this terrible thing that happened. Now what? So we don't necessarily want to do that. A lot of times people can follow their own intuition and what needs to go into the healing of their trauma. We also want to allow for that too. So there is a group called MAPS that is pretty far advanced in their clinical trials of MDMA-assisted therapy to treat post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right.
So as part of their training protocols, they often do have certain types of, theoretical backgrounds used. The premise that a lot of trauma is stored in certain aspects of the body, and that so the body really needs to be a focus and emphasis in working. Historically, we always haven't done a good job of recognizing how kind of our mental health is experienced in the body and not just in our minds.
Like hypervigilance, when you're, someone surprises you to say hello or does this, and your trauma response is to just completely jump and scream. So those kinds of things can be sort of corrected through PTSD, psychedelic integration.
Yeah, I mean, the MAP studies have shown that people's PTSD scores can drastically reduce experiencing memories, flashbacks, nightmares. Hypervigilance is definitely a big one. There's some other kind of domains that we sometimes look at.
Now, many people have the out-of-body kind of dissociative experience. So with people who are accustomed to dissociating, might that be kind of easier for them to surrender as a result of the dissociation? I heard that people with borderline personality disorder who often have problems with their identity and having a solid identity can have some problems and actually not reap benefits from things like ketamine therapy, precisely because they don't want to lose the self. They're trying to find the self. I spoke to a woman who did ketamine therapy and has borderline personality disorder, and she said that it made her more depressed. I just thought, oh, that was very interesting. So the dissociation and that.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are such excellent questions.
Oh.
And, you know, this is where, you know, as a physician, I like to be very clear about answering that we don't know the answers to those questions.
Yeah.
I think they're interesting to think about and probably could help inform future research.
But I did want to ask you about the preparation and the integration. I felt very comfortable having a woman do it in the non-medical setting. And I think that was also specific to me and my, hesitation and anxiety about completely dissociating with someone I didn't know, especially, with a man. So I wondered what exactly takes place during the preparation psychotherapy.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it is, certainly, worth considering, for people who are wanting to, do a psychedelic or participate in a study. So I think, people just really thinking carefully about, those aspects, if they are considering doing something like this is critical. And like I mentioned, preparation and integration, if you look at our studies, it's relatively circumscribed because the nature of studies is to follow certain protocols. We are a clinical trial site, which means that we are usually, for a lot of our studies, one of many sites around the country following the same protocol. And so we try and have a certain level of standardization between those different sites about what's being done to help with the validity of the data.
Right.
I think we very much openly acknowledge that there could be much better ways of doing it and many different ways of doing it. So, our preparation sessions, these are different than other drug trials in that we are offering psychological support and therapy. So to that end, we do think that a person's narrative, their personality, their psychological coping mechanisms, their strengths, are important to be really acknowledged and made more aware of, both for the sake of the participant and also for the therapist to be able to know about that person. There's a lot of, physical exam, laboratory work, careful sort of mental health and physical health evaluations done as part of the screening process. But in terms of the kind of the psychological support, psychotherapy preparation, we really just ask people to tell us everything about their lives as much as possible with, certainly no expectation that they go into details that they don't want to go into, but from, even what their parents' lives were like before, they had them, more about their heritage, how their mother's pregnancy was with them, everything about their family dynamics growing up. We definitely ask for, their key life events. And then in terms of, other parts of the preparation, like I mentioned, we really, tell them about, say it's a study for psilocybin, which is found in a variety of mushrooms, that grow around the world. We tell them, okay, here's some information about psilocybin. Here are some things that could potentially happen, physically in your body when you take psilocybin. Here's, what happens, potentially in your mind or emotionally. We mentioned that there are people that have, really in those altered states of consciousness experiences that are maybe very different than their normal day-to-day consciousness, which might sometimes be called spiritual experiences, mystical experiences, transpersonal experiences, other sorts of non-ordinary, so to speak, states of consciousness. A lot of different things can happen. And this is where we start to teach them certain kind of techniques towards approaching, their dosing sessions, invite them to use an attitude of really surrender to whatever experience is going to happen to them. And to really just kind of, instead of trying to resist or run away from challenging experiences or things that they sometimes don't feel safe to explore psychologically, this study might be a good opportunity to actually become curious and open, and see if you can really embody attitudes of kind of compassion and self-awareness because we think sometimes people's symptoms, quote unquote, are actually information trying to, transmit something to the person.
Yeah.
And that if they're trying to really avoid the experience of those, symptoms, then the message is still going to try and, the body's still going to try and put that through until the person really fully experiences the message. Psychedelic treatments really started to be used in Western medicines in the 1950s and 60s. There actually were 40,000 or more research subjects dosed with a variety of psychedelics, mostly LSD, but some others back in the 50s and 60s. That research was shut down for regulatory reasons in 1970 and was mostly, we think now, for political reasons rather than truly scientific reasons. There is a tradition in the Western medicine of using kind of a period of preparation for psychedelic treatments where the therapists meet with the participants in our study or the people who are going to take the journey. So the preparation is really just a chance to develop a rapport and comfort level with each other, which is, really important in all aspects of medicine and psychotherapy, but we think is particularly important in psychedelic psychotherapy, so that there's a big emphasis on developing that therapeutic rapport. All our dosings are done in a very comfortable living room-like setting at our center where the therapists are with them the entire time, really monitoring their safety and also supporting them psychologically and emotionally. We really encourage people to try to see if they can go into sort of an interior introspective space.
Right.
And then we usually do what are called integration follow-up sessions afterwards, where we spend some time talking about the journey and talking about their dosing experience. It seems to be very likely that after a psychedelic journey, there's a period of neuroplasticity where the brain is maybe more open to making certain changes. Really delineating that further in scientific terms, I can try to do, but the long story short is there's so much we still don't know.
Yeah.
But sometimes an analogy is used well, here in Florida, we don't always have this experience, but, in places where there's snow, if there's tracks kind of built into the snow and you're skiing or sledding or something, you just kind of keep following that groove most of the time. And it's kind of hard to jump that groove. And we think that maybe that's the case in the brain for a lot of people, and maybe also in the case with depression, OCD, eating disorder, where people get trapped in these ruminations or behavioral habits. Yeah, and so the psychedelic, we think, might be sort of like a freshly fallen snow and give a bit more ease in terms of jumping some of those grooves and creating a new pathways. But that's why the integration is important, because the grooves are still somewhat there. And so it usually requires some intention and support. And that's most people come into the study with intentions of making some sort of change. So the integration is there to help support, perhaps that period of neuroplasticity that occurs. So
thank you. That was very informative. That was great. I think that was such a great analogy about the snow. That makes so much sense. Could you talk a little bit about the studies that you're conducting and how people can participate? How do you determine whether or not they have these problems?
One good way is to go to our website, which is segaltrials.com, SEGAL trials.com. And once you get there, it's pretty easy to find ways to get in touch with us about learning more about our studies. There's also my Instagram, which I'm not always super active on posting on, but I'm trying to do better in that, which is Dr. Scott Fisher, DrScottFisher.
I have a very active mental health Instagram, which is Holly Hearing Things. I really like alliteration. And I can also post that to my Instagram for people.
Okay. Yeah, perfect. That'd be wonderful. So it's always good, depending on when people are, hearing this, to know that what I tell you now could be, yes, exactly. What I tell you now could be very different, say 6 months, a year, 2 years from now. But what we have right now, as of June 2023, is we're actively enrolling 2 studies with a number more to start. One of our main studies we're working on right now is the study of LSD to treat generalized anxiety disorder.
Interesting.
Another one is a study of psilocybin to treat treatment-resistant depression, and that is defined as actually medication treatment-resistant depression, where people have tried at least 2 antidepressants at adequate doses during their current episode of depression and have not gained sufficient response to those drugs that they have tried. We'll have another study of 5-MeO-DMT for treatment-resistant depression starting, one in the fall, likely starting, of NN, or kind of what's sometimes known as like the regular DMT, which occurs naturally in ayahuasca for major depressive disorder. There's also a study of psilocybin for alcohol use disorder that we hope will start soon. And actually, hopefully sometimes next year, we may have a what's known as the FDA phase 1 study in normal, healthy volunteers, although I don't always like that verbiage, but that's kind of what's often used, of 5-MeO-DMT. So, and you know, we're in talks with a lot of other groups about other studies that hopefully we'll be able to participate on in years to come. We're really experiencing a lot of growth here. So if people are interested, please reach out to us. Also, if there are therapists or mental health practitioners that want to learn more about, you know, potentially training and entering this field, that's also something else I'm open to people contacting me about.
Wow, that's amazing.
So I think, you know, this has been such a pleasure to, you know, share with you. And, you know, I love talking about this stuff. We gave a pretty good summary. You know, in my opinion, the best part of this whole experience has been hearing about what happened with your psychedelic experiences. So I really want to thank you again for sharing those, because I really think that made this discussion come to life in certain ways for your listeners. And maybe someday, you know, in the future we can do this again, and I can give updates on the research, and maybe you know, I'm sure there's a lot of topics we can explore that we could go into more detail on.
I would absolutely love that, because this has just been so great, and I just want to thank you so much for your time today, and being here. And I know that you're obviously very busy, so I just really appreciate it so much, and I hope that people who watch or listen will either change their minds about psychedelics, or maybe become interested in possibly participating in the trials in South Florida. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, I would like to reiterate, please reach out to us on our website, seagulltrials.com. Or on my Instagram, Dr. Scott Fisher. And yeah, I would love to come back and revisit some of these topics and explore new ones. So thank you very much, Holly.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone. Bye.